Hey folks, Steve here with a special video for you today. This is going to be our introduction video for our series covering The Fall of the Third Reich, a game designed by Ted Racer, published by Compass Games, that covers 1943 to 1945 in the European theater of operations of World War II. And as the title might suggest, covers the Allies arriving in Europe in force to the continent and defeating the Third Reich, the Axis powers in Europe. And we have the map here, which I should point out is made up of two map sheets, here and here, and I have them lined up with the overlapping hexes in the seam pretty good, better than I usually do in trying to make two maps come together. And I have one big sheet of plexiglass covering both maps. I have a sheet of plexiglass that I had made to the dimensions to cover two mapper games, two maps put together. So we managed to get that all covered with the one nice big sheet of plexiglass. Now I'm just barely starting setup, and it's going to be a little slow going. So this video will probably be made up of different chunks that cover probably several different days of me getting a chance to record, so you may just see things start to change on camera as we go. And to anybody who was watching some of my previous videos, you're going to notice that hopefully the video fidelity looks a little different. It turns out at some juncture, either myself or my wife was using the camera, and somehow the video settings had been set, or the lighting settings had been set for like daylight outside quality light, or a setting that's specific for that, but I changed it, so hopefully this looks a little bit better, is a little bit easier to see, a little brighter, I hope, and let me know what you think of that. The only other way to improve lighting would be to set up a bunch of light boxes in here, which I can do, but then there's just a whole lot of hard light that will hurt my eyes eventually over time, so I'm not sure I want to do that. But yeah, we're getting it set up here. Now the map runs from, as you can see, France in the west to the stretches of Russia in the east and the Black Sea over here. You can see a little bit. The south end of the map ends, it cuts off a little bit of Greece and is terminating at basically Sicily. And as you can imagine, the North African theater is pretty much over at this point by 1943, and so really we're going to be seeing, if we're following a historical track, the invasion of Sicily and the invasion of southern Italy to bring Italy down, and then eventually later, several turns into the game, you would expect to see landings in France via D-Day, and all the while the Russian steamroller fighting its way towards Berlin from the east. And really the game actually starts around Operation Citadel in the east. So you have the Kursk pocket, the Battle of Kursk there that we'll get into. There's a marker for Kursk, the defensive network that the Russians had set up around the pocket that the Germans really failed to collapse, and they lost a lot of armor doing that. So that whole situation will be set up when we get there. But this game operates largely at the core level with some divisions, and we'll be looking to set that up over time. And air forces are largely abstracted. So you have a few, the Germans have 3 Luftwaffe counters that represent their air force. The Allies have a variety of air counters that they use for theirs. And that all kind of plays into, are the Allies doing strategic bombing? Are they doing more, ground support? I've got to read through all the rules yet. I haven't really fully read through the rules in a while, so I'm a little rusty there, looking to get into it. But the map is pretty clean and easy to see. I've made a few errata adjustments, so there were a few hexes that needed to be marked, or I used a pen and sort of created a bunch of dashed lines on certain hexes that have like unplayable sections of them. This is all covered in the errata. If you look at the errata, just a warning, it is much bigger than it really is. It's not as bad as it looks. There's some clarifications for the most part. The actual errata is relatively minimal, and the map stuff was really easy and unobtrusive, and it probably won't come up a whole lot in the game, I suspect. So what I did realize as I was punching counters is that there are a lot of fort counters that start on the map, and there's no setup sheet. What you get is that each counter has the hex number on it as to where it starts the game. So it's either going to be a reinforcement, and we'll enter the game later, and I'll put the reinforcements up there, or it starts on the map somewhere, and that location is determined by what the counter says. There's only one scenario for this game because of that. It's just you're going to play 1943, you're going to start on turn 1, you're going to play turn 12. If folks have variations or they want to come up with like a 1944 scenario, you'll have to do that on your own. There's no official version for that, and you would then have to come up with a setup chart or something. But to me, this is all well and good. I was going to play the big game anyway, so 12 turns to cover, and the setup should be straightforward. The only thing I'll say is that as I had sort of separately organized the fort counters, because I knew it would work this way, I put them in their own baggie once I bagged up the punch counters, in that it means you really have to look at every counter. Now fortunately the game only has like a sheet and a half of counters, so there's not a whole lot, but you have to look at each one and figure out where it is, and then you start to get a sense of like, oh, hex row like 35 starts as somewhere over here, and then you look on the y-axis and you find it. It's not so bad, but you got to look at every counter basically to set up the game. And I realized that the forts should probably be placed first because you're going to put units on top of them. And I would advise anyone looking to set up the game to do the same thing. And you can kind of see like where are all these forts at? Where are they located? Well, there's a whole line set up here in Italy, sort of in the midsection that separates central and northern Italy from southern Italy, and the boot heel down here. There's a few scattered around this area to sort of cover the non-mountainous terrain of Italy. There's several protecting the regions of Greater Germany over here in the east, and some in critical areas like let's see, what is that? Budapest, I think, maybe? Yeah, Budapest. So there's a fort in Budapest. There's these forts over here. And then in the west, you sort of have that Atlantic wall where there are, sorry, I'm like fighting with my camera. There are forts in a lot of these landing hexes and beaches, and then there's something resembling already a line of forts sort of protecting Germany. So you get to the basically the border of Germany, and you sort of are set up for that final defense line for the Axis. It's a little weird seeing the forts there already, and I'm just, it's probably historically appropriate. It's just weird to think about in terms of what I'm used to seeing. So that all works fine. But next I will be setting up the units themselves and the markers. So there are a number of different markers. There are some markers that represent the command ability of the Stavka command of the Russians, and the primary command structure of the Wehrmacht that are placed in like towns and cities and project command range and stuff. All those are kind of held off map. I still got to kind of understand how all of those work. But yeah, I mean, so far so good, right? We'll look to keep setting things up. There's a victory point track in the bottom right down here. That will matter. It's got some glare on it. You can see down here. That will matter as the Allies are looking to take the victory hexes. And you can see a couple on the map here. Milan, Munich. Those are all victory point hexes. The other important spaces in Germany, you can kind of see there's in Berlin and a couple of these other areas over here. Those have sort of like a factory symbol, a gear representing a factory. Those impact the German replacement rates and are really key to ending the game. So they're kind of like in these obviously important parts of Germany. So the Allies do have to get pretty far into to the historical place that they want to be, I guess. Now this game apparently can be played, you can play it 2-player, You can play it 3-player and you can play it 4-player as well, and that puts some adjustments on how you adjudicate victory and like what spaces on the map you want to focus on as you go. I'm just playing it solitaire, and so I'm going to treat it like a 2-player game, and I will be playing both sides, I guess, to the best of my ability. That's the best I can do here. There's no solitaire system, and there's not really any hidden information, so I can kind of play it straight up, I think, for the most part. You can see there's like clear terrain, there's forest, there's rough terrain, there's mountains, there's swamp, all the kind of, or marsh is probably what it's called. There's also, rivers and, major rivers, minor rivers, different things that will probably affect combat to certain degrees. And the other thing is the map is divided into 4 sort of fronts or theaters. So there's the Mediterranean front, and this white line you can see, and it gets harder to see once you're on land, but when we're closer, it's easier to tell. But basically, the Mediterranean front is over here. So this whole, basically Italy is the Mediterranean front. Over here, right where my hand is the Balkan front. And the Balkans, that's pretty straightforward. Then from like here up is considered the Eastern Front theater, and then obviously everything sort of over here is the Northwestern theater, which really just covers most of France, except for the chunk that's down here, and Western Germany and the Low Countries and all of that. And so there are some minor adjustments about like where do you have your air station for, what front are they in, and there are even, you can kind of see it here, retreat compasses are different. So it's all really basic stuff that you would have to imagine, right? If you're allied over here, you're going to retreat that way. If you're Soviet allied power over here, you're going to retreat that way. Nothing surprising here. It's all really straightforward stuff. The other important thing on the map that's worth taking a look at are these landing beaches. So all the beaches in the game where you can do amphibious landings are marked with these sort of extra hexes that define what kind of landing zone it is. So for the most part, in Italy, they are all marked AL. That means allies. So any allied beachhead marker or faction can invade on that beach. But in France, you do have the more designated beaches. So some that are marked for the Commonwealth or Britain, and some marked for the U.S. So you do have some of those sort of historical beach landing approaches that we'll look at in time. The Russians are going to start, obviously with a whole bunch of stuff going on over here, and the Germans, and then elsewhere, most of the Allied units are going to be off map, planning the naval invasions. And while we do have some leeway in deciding where we're going to do landings, I suspect I am just going to play a very historical game just so I can feel out the system and not like do really wild stuff where I'm not sure what effect that's really going to have on the game. So, getting into Sicily, rolling up Italy, doing the invasions here or near enough. I might do things slightly differently, but I'm not going to go really wacky crazy in the playthrough. We'll probably play it pretty close to history, but I'll say I'm pretty stoked. Excuse me. I'm pretty stoked to try this out because I play World in Flames, but so many of my World in Flames games, get to like 43 or they don't go all the way, and so you sort of get to this point where the allies are really starting to pick up pace and be the attackers, but then like the game ends because someone's moving or we can't keep playing or we restart or we move houses to whose game is playing at whose house, whatever, and we restart. So this whole, the whole aspect of like, oh, the Axis runs wild in the first few years of the war, we're all very familiar with that. But an opportunity to play through the game where it's like, hey, here's the Allies, they are on the offensive from the get-go for the whole game, is an intriguing thing, and in situations that I'm not as used to in my big, monster game kind of situation of playing games. Not that this is even really a monster game. I'm not sure it qualifies, but it'll be a fun change of pace for me just from a setting and scenario perspective. Now there are other games that cover this sort of time frame. So I do have A Mighty Endeavor Deluxe Edition from Multiman Publishing that is on its way to my doorstep. That starts in 44 and is really principally about the landings in Normandy and then the offensives into Germany. The deluxe edition includes an eastern map for the east, but it's really like the Russians starting here and getting into Berlin. So that game might be similar in some ways, but again, it's focused on 44 to 45, where this includes the 43 campaigns against Italy, and it's just a broader game. So there are other games that do this. I'm going to try some of those out in the time to come. But yeah, I'm looking forward to rocking through this one. So I'm going to put a little break here for me as I continue to do setup, but I just want to do an intro to the introduction and talk about some high-level stuff before we get going. So we'll see things in we'll see a change here on the map in just a second. Okay, I just wanted to show the setup for the Soviets. So obviously I start up here in Leningrad, and you can see the breakdown from there, and right there is the Kursk salient that is in play, and some reserves, blah, 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 all the way down the line. The Soviets are set up, obviously, really far on the east part of the map, but everything's going to trend this way over the course of the game. I've got a little baggie of these conditional Soviet units that come in, I think when like some of the Eastern European countries fall. I'm going to have to read the rules on that just to double check. And then I also had put the reinforcements across the several turns up here on the turn track. The turn track numbers for each turn are nice and big, so you can put the units for reinforcement on there really easy. And I will say it is a good thing that it's sort of, I might complain about the hex numbers being on the counters and having to set up each unit. I have to look at it, find the hex, put it on. It did fill in easy because I knew what the line was going to look like. So as you picked up, it's like, okay, it can only be in so many places. Boom, it goes there. That even if you had to set up a unit on a fort hex, the nice thing is when I put the forts down, they have the hex number on them. So just, it's like, okay, once you start putting counters down, it covers up the hexes. But for setup, you can still see the hex number because it's on the counter. I don't know. A really minor thing. Just I appreciate that, at least, as I'm getting started here. So just wanted to show what that looked like. You can see, there we are. East front is whoosh, all the way out here. And we'll see what happens there. And then obviously you can imagine that a lot of German units are going to set up right along this hex row line. And I do think, in retrospect now that I've set up, what I probably would want to do, just to make this go a little faster, I mean, it only took, 5 minutes less, is organize, pick a hex, and then from here to here, I'll put it in a little baggie, and from here to here, a little baggie, and here to here, a little baggie, just so it's not all one big bag, and I'm trying to sift through things. That could, in theory, make things faster, but I'm not sure I need to do that, so... yeah, I don't know. Just some commentary as I'm getting started here. We'll get back to setup. Okay, here we are with the game, I think, set up, or as set up as I can make it. I've got every counter somewhere on the board, which is good. And you can see that, our east front is all well and lined up. There's a few hexes where the Germans don't actually have units in them, just down here, but for the most part, you can see sort of the front line as it is. You can see some of the minor powers. So the Romanians are stretched out a little bit, or this game has it as an O. So the Romanians are set up over here. You've got some Hungarians. You have Bulgarians. You have some Italian forces in Greek areas. As well as the Germans down here sitting in Athens, apparently. And then, Italians in Italy, though very spread out, right? I mean, they're just kind of all over the place. And I can tell you, it is hard to defend all of Italy, right? That's a lot of coastline. That's a lot of places and landing areas that you care about. So it'll be hard for them to defend there. And then you can see the Germans in the west. They're kind of spread out. There's some guys down here in occupied France and Vichy. Or I guess they probably have collapsed Vichy at this point. And then, yeah, the Atlantic Wall here. The Allies have units in the England box that are building up. They have units that are in the Mediterranean box over here. And importantly, they have the two beach landing markers. So basically, the way that this ends up working, they just have the two, it looks like, here on turns 1 through 5. And I haven't read the invasion part of the rules yet. That's the next section that I'm getting to. That the Commonwealth will have a beach landing marker that their units can be supplied through, and then there's a U.S. one similarly that can supply the U.S. unit. Now, once we get to the point where I think some of this will get easier, but there are allied beach landing markers that the British and the U.S. can both use for supply. and I had just read the supply rules, which are kind of interesting. I mean, they're nothing too crazy, but they operate for the most part on, well, there's really two different methods of getting supply. The Western Allies have their own sort of method of tracing supply, and then the Axis and the Soviets sort of share a method of supply. So for the Germans, their primary supply is really going to be based around tracing to these factory places. And a factory space has to be able to trace to another factory space. So, these are the two on the eastern part of the map for the Germans. One in Silesia, one over here, the Upper Silesian Industrial Region in Berlin. So you can trace a certain number of hexes back to those areas and be in supply. Otherwise, because those are ultimate supply sources, the Germans have to trace back to a German-controlled or Axis-controlled town or city. They can count 4 hexes back to a town, 8 hexes back to a city, and then as long as that town or city can trace an unlimited number of hexes back to an ultimate supply source, then those units are in supply. So this is, and to me, I'm used to playing World in Flames. The towns and the cities are kind of acting like secondary supply sources that trace back to the home country, special place basically. So it's a supply model that makes sense to me. The Soviets act in the same way. They're ultimately relying on cities and towns, but they're tracing to the eastern map edge or the northern map edge beyond Leningrad, I guess. So just the backfield off map as the USSR, and assuming you're able to trace thusly, then your units will be in supply. So what it does do, and I find this kind of interesting, is it makes the towns and the cities really important as sort of lily pads to adjudicate your supplies. And it is a little bit different than some other games, right? I mean, in World in Flames, there's like an HQ, and the HQ is sort of funneling supply, assuming that HQ is on the rail line. This game doesn't have rail lines. The map is not so busy. They've sort of abstracted it a little bit, so it's like what you're really trying to do is just, you could imagine that the towns and the cities do represent that critical infrastructure and railroad networks that you're gonna need. Now the funny thing is, I mean, there's enough towns and cities across the map that it's not like it's like some impossible thing. Like they come up often enough, but that is going to help drive your advance, right? You're gonna liberate Kiev as the Soviets, and then that gets you enough supply range that you can be looking at taking Vinnytsia or getting down to Odessa, which will help send you forward across the board. And so what it's going to I guess, reinforce. I don't know this for sure, but I'm making a guess that, like, to a certain degree, you're not going to be making like really huge one like lopsided advance. You do have to kind of, make your advance across the map, taking the critical junctures, the cities, places of importance that will help you drive forward. Right. I mean, and I saw some comments in some of the like, I don't know what you call them, rating comments on Board Game Geek, where somebody had a real big problem with the lack of rails and the way supply worked there. I don't think it's really a big deal. I mean, I think the map, it has enough towns and cities where it's really just like, you've got to have somewhere to land and a place to get supply from. If there was really isolated, where there was like only a few towns or cities on the map, then I could see where like you'd get some weird ahistorical situation. But I think it's just, the cities and towns will drive your action. You need to take those, but you would take those anyway, and you'd be using those as your staging points, and you'd be using the infrastructure of the towns and cities and the roads leading to them to project your supply, to ferry forward your supply. So to me, I mean, that makes sense. If you didn't want, like, the fact the game avoids a whole like rail system concern, this makes the game a little easier to parse through. Now the Western Allies are a whole different story. So basically, as we see, I have all these landing zones for the Allies to land in, whether that's up in the northwest or down here. Once you place a beachhead marker, wherever that's going to be, units in it or adjacent to it are supplied, because it's sort of just, the game assumes, right, that the Allies have the sea control, whether it's the Mediterranean or the North Sea or, off into the Atlantic. The Allies have control, so they can get supply to the coasts, and so you're in supply there. And then what the Allies will have are these chafe markers, basically, and so they're the expeditionary force, command structure. There's different numbered ones. So there's a 1, there's a 2, there's a 3, there's a 4. There's no back, so it's just 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then where you place these, there's a point in the phase where you do it. You're either going to put them on a beachhead or a controlled port city, and then those have a multiplier for the range, and that range is also on these counters. So 4 is your best one. So just for this example, I'm going to talk about the 4, the big one, that you want to be driving, your deep advances into Europe. I think off a beachhead, the multiplier is a 2. So 4 times 2 is 8 hexes. So if we did that, say, at the Anzio landing, we just went all in here, we could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hexes, and still be in supply as the Allies, which is, you can imagine, the majority of Italy, right? Now, once we get further up, where it's like, oh well, we don't need it all the way down there. We can move this, and we can move it up. We can move it up to Livorno, for instance, and then project 8 hexes out this way if there's a landing marker, or I believe that's considered a port. That's a city port. So then it would be some number. So the very best place that you want to be looking at are the special city ports, and I'm just going to show, let's see if I can find it. Okay, yeah, get it on camera very easily. Antwerp has that big green dot, which means it's a port city, or a city or a port or whatever, city port, but it has a ×5. So that ×5 is applied if you have a chafe marker in there. So let's say that the Allies have done well, they've gotten onto the continent, they've pushed forward, they've captured Antwerp via that hard-fought campaign, and they plug their chafe 4 marker in there. Well, then they're going to be able to supply, they can trace out to 20 hexes. 5 times 4 is 20. Well, where's, how far away is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. That gets you out to eastern Germany, out like this way, 20 hexes away. basically. I mean, it gets you basically all of France and out to here if you manage to take Antwerp and you put the shape marker there. So what I think this does, and we'll see it in practice, is that the supply system for the Western Allies, which is not necessarily land-based, it's about how big of a port can you capture that can open up the floodgates of supply. So capturing, it's a shame, like a really advanced system might say, if you capture this port, you can get these many supply markers or something onto the continent, but this game doesn't use that kind of supply system. Le Havre is, can get some supply. All of these areas can get you to some of these areas over here, but once you capture Antwerp as the Allies, I mean, you really stop having supply problems because Antwerp is big enough of a port that you can get a lot of good stuff coming into the continent to supply your armies who can advance further afield and all of that. It's in some ways a bit of an abstract form of supply when you think about it, right? Like say, well, yeah, Antwerp's valuable and it should be valuable. So how do you make it valuable? Either if we were playing a game where you actually have to put supply points on an HQ or something, or this you count how many ports you control, and that means you can supply this many units. But we're not using that system. We're using a different one, a little more straightforward. You can trace, which is nice and easy, but it still puts importance on important junctures or important ports like Antwerp, at least for the Western Allies. Similarly, there's Marseille down here, which is a _4. So again, maybe you put a 3 over here, we get 12. Well, 12 is going to get you pretty far. So I mean, it's just one of those interesting things of how the Allies really are operating off the beaches. My only regret is that they don't have a rule in the game unless I haven't gotten to it yet. So I'll qualify that if the Allies take Paris, that could be used as a supply junction or something. But whatever. I'll get into it. This video is going to get long if I talk through each and every rule that I learn as I read here. So yeah, the game is set up. We'll be looking to get into that. The game's probably going to start with some invasions and different things. So that's an important part of the rules. I got to make sure I'm smart on. But yeah, you can kind of see how things are starting to line up here. So supply system not incredibly difficult. It kind of makes sense. So you just got to watch what markers you're putting where and plan ahead where you're going to go and where your shape markers are going to go, or wherever what town or what city is going to be part of the next offensive. So yeah, let's move it forward to, I guess, the next section of the video. Okay, so I think I've got things mostly set up here. There might be a couple of markers where I could place in a better location for the moment, but I think we're good. So I think I can probably get going on turn 1. I can double check the counters and a few other things, but I think we can get started. Now the game's going to start really with an Allied invasion, and the Allied player can kind of decide what they want to do. Now, I'm reading some books on the Allied sort of liberation of Europe. There's a trilogy by Rick Atkinson called the Liberation Trilogy, and I've started to poke into that. And I do like to sometimes talk about the books that go with a game, a pairing of books in a game or a book in a game. Now, obviously, there are some East Front books that are worth looking at or that I've read and have opinions on. I sort of talked to that in my Dark Valley video series, so if you really want to see that, you can dig through that video series. For this one, I'm looking at the Liberation Trilogy, and right now, I'm just going to show you these two books. So this is the second book in the series, this is the third book in the series. Second book in the series, third book in the series, oh my. So the war in Sicily and Italy, 43 to 44, and then the war in Western Europe, 44 to 45. I do have the first book, and I'm reading it. It's on my nightstand, so I won't show that first book. But the first book covers the Allied landings in North Africa, so Torch. Now, Torch is out of scope of this game. You don't see the invasion of North Africa. The game sort of, in some ways, potentially expects you to do the invasion of Sicily and Italy. So, really, the Day of Battle book is going to line up with this game, and I haven't gotten to it yet. I'm about a fifth or a quarter of the way through the first book, so I still got a ways to go before I reach the Day of Battle, at least at the time of this recording. And of course, this video that you're watching right now has been recorded over the course of weeks because life is getting very busy and it is hard for me to get to recording anything and reading up on the game and doing everything else. So if you want to play this game and have a pairing, I think Rick Atkinson's books are probably a good pairing. The North Africa book, obviously a little out of scope, but there you go. Now I'll say, me reading that book, the first book anyway, as far as I've gotten, has kind of pointed out that by this point in the war, July, August 1943, when the game begins, the Allies had already decided, or had, the invasion of North Africa precluded an invasion of Italy, the soft, and the whole soft underbelly of Europe strategy. And the Allies had, the book covers a whole, all the conversations and talking about, why they didn't land in France directly, even though the Americans kind of wanted to do that. And there was sort of the attitudes and the expectations of the Americans were such that they might have preferred to land in France first, but that, through negotiation and all these things, they did the Operation Torch and then Italy first. So while this game provides the Allied player the latitude to kind of change up the game, from a historical perspective, they were already all in on, going for this Italian landing. At the beginning of the game, the Allies have a few landing markers, the beachheads. They start in the Mediterranean box. They're right here. They start in the Mediterranean box. They have little M's on them, and they're available from turns 1 through 5. Now, if you play the historical variant, which I'm going to, the game will want us to invade Gela and Syracuse on Sicily via these landing spots right here. And we will do that because I'm going to play the historical game. I'm interested to see how well the game can adapt to the historical situation. Even knowing that we could go ahistorical, this is what I want to do with the game. If you're playing this and you want to do the ahistorical thing and do crazy landings elsewhere, by all means do so. And what is really interesting is that in terms of strategy in this opening stuff, there are some constraints. Like, you can't even do invasions of northern France on certain turns because the weather is too choppy and bad for it. So you could try and say, well, I'm going to relocate those beachhead markers from the Mediterranean box to the English box, and there are units in the England box, not the English box, the England box. Up here, there are units that start up there. So you could conceivably try to move the beachhead markers or wait until next turn when some additional beachhead markers come in as reinforcements for the Allies. You can't see them, but they're hidden up here. The Allies get more, and that is supposed to be sort of to help make landings near Naples and Taranto. But you could say, I'm going to move the beginning beach landing markers to the England box, and I want my other landing markers in the England box or whatever. And you could try to do something over here way earlier than the historical one, but I don't think that's a very good strategy. I mean, it's there maybe as a historical option if you get past the weather and you really, like you're saving up your stuff to go do that. You could conceivably do that, but I don't think it's a very good idea. And the reason I say that is that once you go into Italy, it changes up the game a little bit. And some folks have pointed out on the forums that, like, you spend more time setting up the Italian units than they are in the game. and I'll explain kind of what that is. The Italians will surrender at the end of a turn, or rather at the beginning of an Allied turn or a new turn, if the Allies have taken, I think it's like a city and 2 towns. And it says Italian, but like the online forums have clarified that Sicily is included. So if the Allies land in Gela and Syracuse, take both those cities and take either Palermo and or Messina, that will trigger Italian surrender. And I think that isn't too far. I think that's pretty close to history, because by the time the Allies had occupied all of Sicily, like the Italian Fascist Council or whatever, like voted to kick Mussolini out of power, and then they were looking to do a peace deal. So like very shortly after the Allies started to get into southern Italy, like they collapsed. So the game, I think, probably sticks pretty good with that whole timeline. If you look at it that way. But there's nothing to stop you if you're not playing the historical variant or whatever you want to call it. Like you could land right away south of Rome. You could do that. You could try to get down there right away. You could invade like here and here instead. Then you don't get an attack on Sicily at all. And I think what's interesting is I think the game probably incentivizes you to do that, to do it ahistorically. I'm not sure there's a huge game reason as to why you would go for Sicily, because if you get into here and you take Rome and whatever, a couple of places, Italy still collapses, all this goes away, maybe the only thing being the Germans are still occupying down here. I'm not sure. It's kind of it's a weird thing, I'll say. And it could be that there's an incentive because of the Allied Air Force mark. So there's one up here, there's one down here, but you really only have access to this one right away, and it helps you capture some towns and cities so that then you have airfields to use to go up Italy. If you don't, you're going to try to attack here and here, but you're not going to have as much air support, and that could cause some problems. So, there's probably, I could spend a whole lot more time talking about why you might invade somewhere else that is not Sicily, but what helps is the Allied air trace marker there, and it is part of the historical variant. So there you go. So yeah, that incentive to not do France, to go ahead and do Italy, is useful. If we tried, what could happen is, okay, you've got these victory cities, Milan, Marseille is nearby in France, but you know what I mean, down here in the south, Marseille, Milan, Rome, what is it, Trieste? Yeah, Trieste is one. You got these victory point cities down here that will continue to be under Axis control because you're busy up here, and it's worth trying to come down here and get those victory points, right? You want to have a strong set of victory points. It might get you closer to the German capital factory spaces sooner, but there's a lot to it. And you could potentially, I think, the Axis could try to strategically move some of these Italian units into France or Germany or whatever to kind of help defend that front. And so the easiest, cleanest way to take out a crap ton of Axis units is taking that city and a couple towns in Italy, and then you knock Italy out of the war, and then the Germans are having to siphon units from here or the Eastern Front to man the line here in Italy, and you're going to put the stress on the Germans. So I don't know. It's like a pro and a con, a double-edged sword. The ahistorical stuff is kind of there, but it's not probably the best choice. So people might complain about that, but to me, that means that this game it's going to be in the grooves of history that you expect. If you're going to play a game like this, you want it to be kind of the historical narrative that you want to see, right? I mean, to me, that makes sense. The other bits of the historical variant are such that it forces the Germans to make some attacks on the Kursk salient. That will probably not go very well for the Germans, and that allows the Russians to kind of have a good counterattack opportunity and sort of bust through here a little bit. And like I said, I'm going to be playing with that historical variant. We're going to see what happens with that. The Russians actually have some reserves, so they are well placed to take advantage of that whole situation. And, that whole Eastern Front, the game within a game is going to be its own, outflanking craziness stuff that's going to have to go down to break apart the German army. The Axis gets plenty of reinforcements, more than I thought they would, across all the turn markers up here. But they will be getting, whittled away over time. And I don't know that the Axis really has any strategic options at a high level. Just looking at the game, it's going to be your big strategic decisions are, where am I going to put my reinforcements? Where am I going to pull units from one front to the other? and try to hold on as long as possible, right? You're not gonna win the war, right? You're gonna hold on as long as possible. That's what you need, and hold on to the victory point cities as long as possible. So everything you do is going to be based around that. Where the Allies, again, the beginning kickstarting of things are going to be pretty historical, and then invading France, like when you can do it and when it's smart to do it, yeah, you have some latitude on what ports you're going to take, but there is going to be a focus up here and trying to get to Antwerp for its great supply capability. It's a great port, so it's represented that way in the game. One other thing I'll point out, you'll notice all these fort markers and where they are. So Ted had noted that it would complicate the game a lot if you were to come up with some fort building mechanism. And his thoughts are that the Germans built their fortifications where they did for good reason. So rather than have this thing where, like, the Germans are moving down here and then they're going to try to build fortified lines, trenches, whatever, fortifications on this line or maybe somewhere else, it basically is saying, hey, if the Germans don't send any guys down here and the Allies just move over the forts, that's, whole situation's foobar. That was the best defensive location. The Germans are either going to get to the best defensive location and hold it or not. Same thing with, like, the West Front. You can see there's a line of forts here. It might be a little hard to see, but these are a line of forts. Likewise there, the Germans want to get to that defensive perimeter line and hold it via the forts or around those forts. If you had come up with, again, some weird fort building rules, you'd have multiple rule sections all about building those things. Instead, they are where they are, even if technically that part of the front hadn't even been fortified yet. It is a design by abstraction and ease, and I get what Ted did there, and I think it makes sense. It's not like there are a ton of forts in a million different places. There's some in the west, there's some in Italy, there's a few scattered forts all around and over here, but that's about it. So I think that was probably a good, smart decision in terms of the rules, because the rules managed to be pretty straightforward without too many goofy things in it. And adding a big fort building rule, would have kind of killed the game over a little bit. And there's a lot of different ways you could have done that. Maybe some sort of like defense support markers or something. But I think this works well. So yeah, there you go. I think from a high level strategic perspective, all those things come into play. The Allies do need to make sure that they're picking up victory point cities. A mad dash to Berlin and Essen is great and all, but you may need to do more than that. You have to have a balanced approach to liberating Europe, and we'll see how well that goes. I am not sure. What's so weird is, like, you can read the rules, you can feel pretty good about them, but not really looking at them and going, okay, now we're going to start this thing, and oh boy, I don't know how well I'm going to do. Because it's such a different system, and it reminds me of other game systems. It's hex and counter, but there's just some nuance in figuring out how to make all the supply tracing work well for your units, and where's the right place to go. All that will be figuring out. So okay, guys. Well, that's probably it for the intro. If I think of more things to talk about before we get rolling, I'll put it maybe in the next video, but I think we've covered it all, right? We've got setup, we've talked about the game a little bit, the nuances of the rules, the strategic considerations for the sides. It's just going to come down to beating each other up on the map, right? With the Allied landings in Sicily. That's how we're going to start this thing. So all right, well, guys, if you like this video, hit like. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. Sorry this is taking so long to get to you. There's a whole lot more for me to cover. I need to do a celebratory video for 1,000 subscribers, so I got to do that at some point, maybe this weekend. So, yeah, that's it, guys. We'll see you in the Turn 1 video. Thanks for watching. Take care. Keep gaming.